Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
Robert stepped out onto the porch of the old, half-rotten wooden house. On his shoulder, the young man carried a huge bag of garbage he had just shoveled out of the biggest room of his new home. Robert, who had just turned 22, had squatted in this little shithole so he wouldn't have to go back out on the street. For years, he had been forced to wander around in noctuaries and other homeless shelters, including heating ducts and the gutters of apartment buildings. That's because Robert hadn't had a place of his own for a long time. Well, the boy reasoned to himself aloud, dragging the garbage bag to the nearest dumpster. A few more walks like this, and then we can settle down for the night. At least now there's room inside for a good night's sleep. The locals looked at the young man with undisguised interest. Robert was homeless, but he looked very neat and clean. Except, of course, he was poorly dressed. However, the young street dweller strove to attend the public bath for the homeless, regularly, once a week, and therefore he never gave off an unpleasant odor. Moreover, he also tried, if possible, to wash all his clothes. He didn't want to sink to the social bottom, and for the sake of that, he was willing to stand in a long line at a charity laundromat, but he felt like a decent person afterwards. "Oh, it's dusty in here," Robert grimaced as he dumped the contents of the bag into the big bright green tank. The young hobo always had a few trash bags stashed in his backpack, just in case. "I don't know if I'll come across some glassware on the way, or if I'll be lucky enough to come across a whole mountain of waste paper at a landfill." When he had finished his work, Robert exposed his face to the first spring sunlight and smiled. Despite all the difficulties he had to overcome every day, the young man could still genuinely enjoy the seemingly simple things, like the coming of spring in the city, or the bottle of clean drinking water he had managed to get, for free, at the local water pump. The boy sighed deeply, taking in the scents of the blooming flowers and the fresh green grass that had just been released from the snow. April this year had been truly beautiful. On the way back, for some reason he remembered his childhood. How his mother used to read Robert a big book of fairy tales at night, and how she used to give him hot milk with honey when he got sick after playing snowballs with his friends in the yard. God, it's been a long time, Robert thought sadly. There's no mom now or our old apartment. Robert didn't always live on the streets. Once upon a time, he was an ordinary child raised alone by a beautiful woman named Betty. He never knew his father, but he didn't need to. His mother had always been the most important and beloved person in his life, and nothing could ever change that. She and her mother always lived a very modest but friendly life. Betty worked as a kindergarten teacher and received a small salary, but she constantly tried to please her beloved son with something. She bought him a soft toy or some fruit. Robert remembered his childhood up to the age of 7 as the happiest years of his life. And then everything changed. Tim worked as a carpenter in a local factory and somehow managed to charm his mother. Robert did not know exactly where and under what circumstances they had met. Most likely, the woman simply hid her suitor from her young son for some time, afraid to frighten him with the new man in their lives. But one clear autumn evening, Tim, with a large bouquet of large, bright yellow roses, appeared on the doorstep of their apartment, and that's when little Robert learned that his mother was going to marry this man. On the outside, Tim looked like an ordinary man, brown-eyed, with a slant to his shoulders. It was easy to see why Betty had fallen so hard for this fairy tale-like giant. Only there was something in his brown eyes that made little Robert uneasy. The boy couldn't tell what it was that got him, but he was absolutely sure that this uncle was definitely not to be trusted. As a child, he could not insist that his mother call off the wedding, especially since Betty herself sincerely hoped that Tim could be a real father, a protector, and just a friend to Robert. This man, in his mother's opinion, would always be a real, reliable support for them. However, from the very first days that Tim moved in with his mother, the carpenter showed them his real and far from friendly character. After the wedding, the stepfather stopped hiding the fact that he was jealous of his wife to almost every member of the opposite sex, including his stepson. Don't you think you spend too much time with Robert instead of giving your husband affection and good cheer? I've been resenting Tim more and more. He'll grow up under your skirt. He won't make a man out of you. Tim, what on earth are you talking about? Robert's mother lowered her eyes, embarrassed and blushing to the roots of her hair. Robert is still very young. He's only in second grade. All children, at that age, need their parents' help and attention. Well, of course, he said in an impertinent tone, and pointedly put his feet on the armrest of his chair, which neither Robert nor Betty could stand. You're ready to do anything and anyone, as long as you don't sit at home, with your own husband. I don't know how you're treating your kindergarten dads. Maybe you've been wagging your tail in front of them for a long time, and I'm sitting here like a deer. The man was not embarrassed when he opened a bottle of beer and took a huge gulp. The sticky foam ran down his chin, causing the stepson's heart to go into a real rage. Drops fell on the upholstery, but it didn't seem to bother the stepfather at all. Tim, how can you talk to me like that? Betty was sincerely indignant. She didn't recognize her husband at such moments. It was as if he had been switched when jealousy was forced upon his head. I dare you. The man started to raise his voice at her more and more. That's right, I'm registered here, in case you haven't forgotten. So now I'm the boss of this house, and you have to live by my rules. Betty wanted to retort, but her stepfather stood up sharply and walked toward her, pretending to take a swing at her in order to punch Robert's mother in the face. Just try it, sputtered little Betty's son, and the next second, he was between him and his mother. His tiny fists clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his skin. What? Smiled Tim unpleasantly. What can you do to me, puppy? With these words, he simply pushed little Robert in the shoulder and he fell to the floor, unable to hold on to his skinny legs. Robert! His mother rushed to him, but his stepfather just smirked and held up his index finger in warning. I hope you and your son have learned what will happen to both of you if you don't listen to me. A week later, Tim forced Betty to quit her beloved job and devote herself completely to family, but it was not a real family. Robert had already realized that the only emotion his mother felt, day in and day out, in the presence of her new husband was fear. The romantic illusions of the former educator cleared away like smoke, and now she was forced to wait every day from work for a complete stranger who never tired of intimidating her, promising to do the most horrible things to her son, if she would not be completely obedient to his will. From constant stress and worry, Robert's mother soon fell ill. Doctors gave her a distressing diagnosis, a brain tumor. The treatment required an enormous amount of money that the family could not afford, and Robert and his mother simply did not have it. As for the stepfather, he only began to drink even more, as he could not think of what to do to help his dying wife, and to be honest, he was easier to forget himself with the help of alcohol than to start doing something. Robert was with her mother until her last day, and was the only person who held her hand as Betty passed away. The stepfather drank more and more, and soon after his mother's death, he began to bring his drinking buddies to her apartment. The stepson, who had already turned 12 by then, tried in every way to stop him from going down to the bottom of the glass, Tim, but instead of gratitude, the boy received only constant pokes and insults. In the end, the carpenter was kicked out of his job for drinking himself intoxicated, and he and Robert, who was still in high school, had almost nothing to live on. Tim was paid a tiny unemployment benefit and some paltry amounts as a single parent, but it wasn't enough, so they struggled to make ends meet. During one of the scandals, Tim threw the teenager out into the street by the scruff of the neck like a scratching kitten. "Get the hell out of here, you punk," he shouted as he literally pushed the boy down the stairs from the 3rd floor. "You know where I've got your lectures already? In my bones. Your liver is going to fail soon enough if you don't stop drinking every day." Robert shouted back at him, while at the same time trying to zipper up the zipper of his old jacket. It was October and already quite cold. Instead of answering, his stepfather gave him an obscene gesture. "You're too clever. If you spend the night outside, you'll understand how to argue with your elders. I'm sick of it." He spat at him last and slammed the door to the apartment. Luckily, the kid had his keys with him that time, so in the middle of the night, when it was just impossible to be outside, Robert came home. As expected, he found Tim snoring on the hall floor, but with a bottle in his arms. Nearby in his room, lying on the bed, some strangers, a man and a woman. Dreadful. The guy wrinkled his nose squeakily and went to sleep in the bathroom, locking himself inside with a latch. In the morning, of course, he was beaten by his stepfather. Fighting between them was no longer a rare occurrence. Robert was able to stand up to his struggling stepfather, but he gave him a big black eye, and the poor guy had to go to school with it. The future homeless man was already in the 8th grade at the time, and like every teenager at this difficult age, was especially vulnerable. Realizing the humiliation and doom of his situation, the boy, however, saw no way out of this situation. Very often he cried in the backyard of the school when no one saw him. He just couldn't cope with his feelings, because after school he had to go home anyway. And there it was all over again. Tim's drinking, hunger, filth. Robert was a nice, good-looking boy, even got straight A's and B's, and his teachers were quite tolerant of him. Everyone knew that he lived with his drunken stepfather, and that they were both almost below the poverty line. But no one could help the poor boy. Tim was Robert's legal guardian, but he never showed up for school meetings. The boy himself, no matter how bad things got between him and his stepfather, never called the police to his house, because he didn't want to end up in an orphanage at the end of school. When he was 16 and graduation was on the horizon, a new tragedy happened in his life. One day, when Robert was at school, Tim, drunkenly, forgot a pot of soup on the gas stove. This led to a big fire, as a result of which, burnt not only the whole apartment, but also the boy's stepfather, who had fallen asleep. It's hard to say exactly what the boy was feeling at that moment. Of course, for all his dislike of Tim, he never wished that fate for him. At the same time, in his heart, Robert knew that sooner or later this was the way things would end. And it was all the fault of his stepfather, who had become permanently attached to the green serpent. The worst thing was that all the documents, including Robert's passport, were completely burned along with the apartment. The boy, in fact, became invisible because it was very difficult and troublesome to restore the documents. And what could Robert do at 16? The only thing he was sure of was that he would never graduate from high school, and he had nowhere else to live. For the last time, with a deep sadness, looking at the huge black stain of soot framing the empty window of his burnt-out apartment, Robert vanished into the evening lights of his city, finally breaking with the past and becoming a homeless man. At first, Robert had a very hard time. He literally did not eat for days at a time and slept on the side of the road, risking getting caught by the police every minute. In desperation, he even tried to steal food from the market and supermarkets, but quickly realized that nothing good could come of it. Robert, by nature, was a very decent man, and the thought of becoming a professional thief caused him only rejection. Then our hero decided to go a completely different way. He began to collect waste paper, glassware, recyclables, and scrap metal. By taking it all to collection points, he made a little money, which was barely enough to buy food. Fortunately, around the same time, he learned about the existence of soup kitchens and homeless shelters, and this information literally saved his life. Previously, Robert had never considered how much help the most ordinary people could give him to have a bowl of hot soup, and at least one night a month spent under a roof. However, the world of the streets was always harsh and unsafe. On several occasions, Robert had to clash with other homeless people who felt that newcomers were not allowed to just shop where they did. We were talking about large shopping malls, where large grocery stores often dumped boxes of food that were either nearing the end of their shelf life or had already expired in the trash. Such feeders were valued by the city's homeless by weight of gold, and the crowd in these places was quite aggressive. No one wanted to share for fear that the new homeless would bring their fellows after them. Of course, Robert got beaten up a lot, but thank God, it never came to anything more serious than the usual scratches and blows. In an effort to earn something, he took the toughest jobs he could get his hands on. In short, he did the best he could. Not so long ago, Robert noticed an old, ramshackle house on the outskirts of the city in the private sector. The house looked quite abandoned, and the little yard in front of it was a sad sight, being overgrown and unmaintained. Robert thought he might as well stay there for a while until he could find a better place for himself. To avoid breaking in like a thief, he asked the neighbors for permission. Fortunately for him, they didn't seem to mind at all. "Why not? Come in and live it up," said the tall, elderly man who owned the neat, small cottage next door. "Do you know what happened to the owners of this house?" Robert asked, just in case. "I don't know if I'm going to move in now, and they'll come suddenly. It would be embarrassing, and they'll probably call the police too." The owner of the cottage just waved his hand. "You don't have to worry about that. They've been dead for 10 years, both of them. They were very old, and their children moved abroad for permanent residence 2 years ago. This house is not worth anything, in fact. I'm not going to be able to live in it anyway, but it will do you good to live in it." "Thank you," Robert smiled back. "Don't worry, I'll live here quietly. I don't drink and I don't like cigarettes. At least I'll have a roof over my head. I'm a bit tired after 6 years on the street." The neighbor nodded understandingly, and Robert went to tidy up the house. As soon as he opened the creaky wooden door, cracked from time, some chips and wood dust fell on his head. After looking at the state of his new home from the inside, the boy said ironically, "Yeah, and there's more work to be done here than I thought." As he took room by room, Robert felt physically relieved. To think that for the first time in such a long time, he would have his own place, and one from which no one would throw him out, and from which he would not have to flee because of another raid on the homeless by the police. Turning over the chairs on the living room floor, he noticed a small antique chest of drawers in the corner, painted light green. "Wow," the young homeless man thought to himself, "probably older than me and even my mother." Robert wanted to see the ornate carvings on the doors, so he stepped closer. One of the doors was slightly ajar, as if inviting the boy to see what was inside. "Well, basically, it's usable, just to dust the shelves," Robert reasoned to himself as he opened both doors. There was nothing on the shelves, but when Robert reached into the back wall, he felt for something, and to his surprise, realized that he had found someone's passport. It belonged to a girl, and judging by her age, a little younger than himself. From the photograph, he was looking at a pretty redhead whose bright blue eyes had the mysterious ability to peer into a person's soul. Well, Robert thought to himself, and it was only a year ago that he had been issued to her. I wonder what happened. She must have lost her passport, and now she is running around. Poor thing, she does not know what to do with herself. This is an important document. Without it, neither to get a job, nor go to college. Robert thought about it. Normally, he should take his fine to the police, and then let them deal with the whole matter themselves. But Robert didn't really want to get involved with the authorities. The last time they had met, the police had been all over him. One day, the police came to the homeless shelter, where he and a dozen other homeless people had been living through the cold winter nights for a couple of weeks now. They did not handle him, as they did all the others. They beat him with a truncheon and threatened to take him to the police station. Miraculously, Robert managed to get out of there. What to do? Leave everything as it is, or try to help this red-headed stranger? In the end, Robert decided to act like a law-abiding citizen and take the found passport to the nearest police station. Once he made his decision, he cleaned himself up and went to his important job. Unfortunately, the precinct itself was not very happy about such a peculiar applicant. The man on duty, a very thin-faced man with square glasses, was more than dismissive of the homeless man. "Boy, do you want it more than anyone else? Why are you picking on me with this passport? It's old, and whoever lost it probably already made another one." "No, it was only issued a year ago, I tell you. Just look what it costs you." Robert tried to explain. His voice went up one octave in excitement. "Hey, don't yell at me, come on. You're too young to talk to me like that. And in fact, maybe you just did not get a reward for this passport, so you want to sell it to us. You come on, show me yours first, and then we'll talk." At that moment, the head of the burglary division came out of his office. Tall and swarthy, he somehow subtly reminded Robert of his stepfather, Tim. It was not so much the appearance, but rather the peculiar behavior of this investigator. Approaching the boy with a swagger, the man looked Robert over from head to toe. After that, the man asked the homeless man with an unpleasant smirk on his lips, "What, citizen, is your conscience at work? Have you come to surrender?" On the index finger of his left hand, the investigator twirled a ring with the keys to his office. Tim had done the same thing once, so Robert knew at once that he would have a very difficult time negotiating with this man. "I don't understand why you're all accusing me of something." With anger in his voice, said Robert, "I just found someone else's passport, and I want to give it to you. To the police, as it should be. Give it to me, don't flicker." The chief rudely interrupted him, and with a quick movement snatched his passport from his hand. But he didn't bother to open it and see what was inside. "Hey, be careful with that. It's a document after all," Robert said impulsively, which caused him to receive an icy look from the investigator. "You are so brave, I see." The policeman's phrase was interrupted by the sudden opening of the front door. A general, accompanied by several officers, entered the police station. The general was inspecting all precincts in the area he was in charge of. There had been too many complaints lately from internal security officers about employees being found guilty of corruption. So the general had to follow up on this issue himself. Seeing all three of them, the general asked briefly, "Greetings, colleagues. What's going on here?" I must say that the general's mood that day was simply disgusting. And if it were not for official duties, you would now be solving much more serious problems for him. "What question did this citizen come to you about?" Again the general asked the investigator. The swarthy policeman's face changed in an instant, and he put on a mask of courtesy and politeness. "General Martin, good day. We had an explanatory conversation with a citizen about how to properly surrender lost documents." Then the general noticed his subordinate fumbling with the ill-fated passport. "Come on, give it to me. What are you clutching in your hand?" Robert, now pale, now blushing, still handed the chief the document Robert had found. But as soon as the general opened it, he staggered back and even had to lean on one of his subordinates to keep from falling. The general knew all too well to whom the document belonged. "My God, citizen, where did you find him?" Turned the general to Robert. Please, you must show me the place where you found this passport." "These are the documents of my daughter, Molly. She was kidnapped 9 days ago. The idiots at the station still can't find her. There's not even a clue. And these people, The general took a deep breath, trying to calm down. "I had crossed the road with some powerful men in Miami," he said grimly, "and they offered me a lot of money to solve their problem. They promised me what they called a fat percentage of the profits. But I quickly explained to them what would happen if they dared to sell their substances in my city. So they decided to steal my Molly and now demand that I agree to their terms, or my daughter." Martin could not finish his sentence, slowly sinking into the chair Stepanov had brought him. His feelings were so strong in the general that he could not hold back the tears that came to his eyes. "Molly is the most precious thing I have in this life," he said, and he blotted his eyes with a soft handkerchief. "And if anything happens to her, I couldn't bear it." Robert felt truly sorry for this high-ranking man, whose heart was now bursting with fear for his kidnapped daughter. "I found this passport in an abandoned house on the outskirts of the city, near the industrial zone," said our hero slowly, trying to make his voice sound as calm as possible. "Come on, let's go," the general decisively ordered. "Show me this house, and I'll do everything else with my guys myself." Robert brought the general to his humble abode, and the general's men searched the place up and down. In addition, Martin's subordinates questioned the neighbors and were able to learn much useful information. There was a girl here, yes, an old woman told them, thin, pale, with long red hair down to her waist. But she appeared in the yard only a couple of times, and always accompanied by 2 muzzles. They looked more like criminals, though they told me they were her brothers. But the house has been abandoned for a long time, and the owners died a long time ago. I wrote down the number of their car. By the way, here you go. Why didn't you go to the police right away, citizen? With a gasp, Martin asked her worriedly, "What am I, an idiot, to get involved with bandits? And I still have grandchildren to raise, and I do not want, in my 8th decade, to die a horrible death." "Well, maybe you're right. Anyway, thank you for your help." A little later, Martin told Robert, "Those bastards, huh? Apparently, they kept her in the house where you live now." The general stomped his foot with all his might and threw his uniform cap on the ground in anger. "Okay, thank you, man. If it wasn't for you, I don't know what I'd be doing right now. You can't imagine how much you've helped me. Maybe I can help you too. What kind of help can I offer?" However, the homeless man, in response, shook his head negatively. "No, thank you very much, Martin," Robert said politely. "I'll stay here for the time being. But if you need anything else, let me know. I'll try to do what I can. I am glad there is news about Molly. I really hope you managed to find your daughter safe and sound." The general smiled friendly and raised his gray eyebrows. "Well, I'm surprised that you don't ask for anything in exchange for your help. It's nice to know that there are still some normal people in this world who are not indifferent to other people's troubles." With these words, they exchanged a firm man's handshake. "Goodbye, Robert," Martin said goodbye to him. "I wish you better times in your life, and as soon as possible." Robert nodded and gave Martin and his subordinates a sad look. "Well, that's the end of my adventure," the boy thought with a sad smile. "I wish his daughter was all right. Still, such a nice man. I wouldn't want him to have to go through the loss of his own child." With these thoughts in mind, Robert headed back to the house. He was literally exhausted from the excitement and fatigue of the day, and all he wanted was to go back to sleep. For the next week, Robert lived as usual, and then one Sunday morning, a luxury motorcade of 3 black Jeeps suddenly stopped in front of his house. Robert realized at once that these were the same cars in which the general had visited him. His hunch was confirmed when the door of one of them opened, and a thin red-haired girl dressed in a very expensive demi-season coat stepped out of the cabin. "Good morning," she told him, smiling. Her blue eyes contrasted wonderfully with her pale skin, golden freckles, and beautiful fiery hair. The boy genuinely admired the beauty of his unexpected guest. "My name is Molly, and I'm the one who owned the passport you found," she went on. "I wanted to thank you, both on behalf of myself and my father. If it hadn't been for your vigilance, no one knows what would have happened to me." "Nice to meet you," Robert said, embarrassed. "And my name is Robert. I just wanted to know, are you all right? Have you been hurt?" "No, it's okay," the girl answered, lowering her eyes. "It was those bandits who kidnapped me right out of the institute before I even had a chance to make a sound. They shoved me into the car, and that was it. Thank God I managed to hide my passport in my dresser drawer. It was in my pocket. When you found it, my father managed to find out from the neighbors the number of the car that brought me here. They'd written it down just in case. Those big guys didn't have time to notice. I was here for more than a week. I was grieving. What a blessing that there are still such attentive and good people in our city as you and your neighbors." "Come on," Robert was embarrassed. "I knew right away that the passport in the abandoned house couldn't have been so random." "Thank you." Molly thanked him heartily once again, and then, unexpectedly for the guy, took out of the car a small, but richly decorated with chocolate and nuts cake. "Shall we have some tea?" she asked cheerfully. "I'm so hungry for sweets after this adventure, it's horrible. Of course, it's not good for my figure, but I don't care right now. It's not every day you can miraculously escape from the clutches of kidnappers. I think it's necessary to celebrate." "Oh, well, good. Then let's go inside, but my kettle's not electric. You'll have to wait for me to heat the stove." "That's all right. You can tell me about yourself at the same time," said Molly, smiling, and together they entered the old, but now cleaned out, and turned into a rather cozy place. "Wow," the general's daughter marveled. "And things have changed a lot since that time. Did you set it up that way?" "Well, I cleaned up a little. What's so surprising? It is absolutely impossible to live in such filth as it was." Robert was pleasantly surprised by the sincere attention and interest this beautiful woman showed in him. They drank tea with delicious chocolate cake and talked a little bit about life. Robert told her about his difficult fate. Strangely enough, Molly was sympathetic and understanding about his homelessness. The young people had a nice conversation, and everyone behaved completely naturally in this conversation. Robert, at one point, felt as if he had known Molly for years, which of course could not be true. As the general's red-headed daughter left, Robert felt a pleasant warmth slowly spreading inside him. In his years of living on the streets, the boy had become accustomed to behaving reservedly, and in some ways even coldly, with other people. This girl, for the first time in such a long time, made his heart thaw. The most amazing thing happened the next day, when Molly, to Robert's great amazement, arrived again. He was just chopping wood in the yard, kindly given to him by an elderly neighbor, when a small red car pulled up to the house. "What, you didn't expect to see me again?" she asked cheerfully. "I brought you some goodies." Surprising as it may sound, the young people began to talk a lot, and Molly tried to visit him more often. She liked spending time with him and talking about the simplest, most ordinary human things. Robert, for his part, was also happy to see Molly, but he never allowed himself to even think of her as his girlfriend. Their relationship remained purely platonic, tender and soulful, like the petals of a newly blooming rose. The boy liked to take care of Molly the way in his mind. It was done by gentlemen in old English novels, which he read, once as a child. And Molly, indeed, saw in him her knight, her protector, on whom you could always rely, to whom you could open your soul without fear, but who would never use it to harm the girl herself. The only problem overshadowing the good mood and joy of Molly's rescue was her fiancé, Michael, whom the general's daughter had known long before the kidnapping. One day, he unceremoniously took her from the house of Robert, whom he disliked as soon as he saw her. To him, this poor tramp was not just a bum involved in rescuing his fiancée, but oddly enough, a rival. "Stay away from my Molly," Michael threatened him then. "I've had enough of these meetings." As if she didn't have any other normal friends to hang out with. "Tell me, what have you done to her that makes her want to see you every day?" Robert, who was determined to fight for the one ray of light that had so unexpectedly appeared in his life, only calmly replied to the young major, "Maybe Molly and I just have something to talk about, unlike you?" "Don't even think about her," Michael hissed angrily at him, then led the indignant girl out of the house and forced her into his car. "Mike, what are you doing? You're hurting me," she cried out as he squeezed her hand with force. "Doesn't it hurt me, Molly? I'm not hurt." He pretended to be a natural sufferer. "I was so worried about you when you got caught up in that whole kidnapping thing. So looking forward to hearing from you that you were alive. And what about you, hanging around some tramp all day? That's not even your rank, Molly. And what have you and him got in common?" Molly pursed her lips in resentment. "You just don't get it, Mike. Robert is different. He's a real person. He's really interesting even just to talk to. And you lately, you become kind of strange and cold." Molly turned her back to the window and hurt. In fact, the girl was not far from the truth, and she was well aware of it herself. Marriage to Molly would be a perfect match for him, for Michael was the son of a powerful businessman, and an excellent chance to dramatically boost his own career in the law, at the expense of her father's influence in the right circles. Michael himself, of course, was not worried about Molly at the time of her abduction, simply because he had never loved her. He needed her as a bargain, and Michael, being a very greedy and cruel man by nature, intended to teach Robert a lesson so that he would not be allowed to look at other people's brides. Having persuaded his men, Michael made sure that Robert, the very next day, was met in the alley on his way home. Our hero fought back as best he could, but a blow to the abdomen made him slowly sink to the cold asphalt. But even this was not enough for Michael. He also prophylactically ordered to burn his old house. Fortunately, the boy's wound was not fatal, but he needed a blood transfusion, and it was urgent. When General Martin found out what had happened, he was terribly angry. Of course, he knew at once whose hand it was, so he called Michael immediately from the hospital. "What are you doing, you little bastard? Do you think you're the king?" "I don't know what you mean, Martin." His daughter's fiancé answered him haughtily. "And why are you talking to me like that?" The general, who had always treated Robert warmly after the incident with his daughter, only became more furious and shouted into the two. "Don't you dare tell me you don't understand. What the hell are you and your bastards doing to Robert? You want a taste of the rough life? Well, I'll give you one. Mind you, if that boy dies today, I'll have you all locked up. Even though you were my son-in-law, you'll go to jail for a long time. Fucking golden youth." The general, muttering hateful curses at Michael, dropped the call. And Michael, after such a pass from the now, definitely, former father-in-law, began to briskly pack his bags, getting ready for the plane. And no force of love for Molly could not stop him. The main thing for such petty people as Michael was, to save his own skin, the rest did not interest him. Meanwhile, the doctors at the hospital where Robert was operated on were at a complete loss. "You see, Martin," the surgeon explained to the general, "the young man has a very rare blood type, third, and his RA factor is negative. It would be very difficult to find a donor now. So take my blood." Martin exclaimed without a moment's hesitation, "I'm definitely type 3, but I'm not sure about my rhesus factor and everything else." When the man gave blood, the doctor looked at him in surprise and said, "Of course, I don't believe in such coincidences, Comrade General, but I bet that you and this homeless man are close relatives. Most likely even father and son." Martin felt himself slowly break into a sweat. It's no joke to hear such news in his old age. Shocked to the core, he asked the doctor, "Tell me, can we do a comparative DNA test right away? Just to be sure." It's better to be 100% sure." The doctor nodded understandingly, but warned Martin that the test would not be ready until 2 days later. Martin agreed, all the more so now that the boy's life was safe, he could take it easy. In the end, the test showed an exact match. The general and Robert turned out to be father and son. And Molly, it turns out, was the homeless man's younger sister by father. A little later, he came to the young man's room along with his daughter and told him everything. Needless to say, how powerful were Robert's emotions at that moment? The boy, who had been an orphan for so many years, had suddenly found a father and a wonderful sister. Robert's heart rejoiced. It was the happiest day of his life, despite the severe stab wound. "It was only later that I realized that you had your mother's eyes, Betty. I loved her very much. I graduated from police school, and I was immediately assigned to work on the streets as a patrolman. Those were terrible years, the 90s. Racketeering and gangsterism were in full bloom. I was in the department 24 hours a day. But why did you break up?" Robert asked. "We had a big quarrel before I left," explained the general. "She begged me to stay, almost on her knees. But I was a fool. I kept saying duty, obligation. Now I know how wrong I was. I would have given anything just to rewind time, but alas." The general wiped the tears from his eyes, and Molly tried to comfort him by stroking his arm. Apparently she was already pregnant at the time. Martin finished his story. "And to think I had no idea I had such a wonderful son. Then I was shot while apprehending a recidivist. It was a very high-profile story, and the press talked about it for a long time. I was first hospitalized in the district center, then I was transferred to a hospital in the capital. That's how your mother and I got lost. Robert, can I find out what happened to Betty now where she is?" Robert looked sadly at the general. "My mother, unfortunately, died many years ago, not long before my stepfather drank himself to death and started throwing me out on the street. I had been wandering around since I was 15, and then he burned down our apartment and himself in the fire. God, Molly told me something like that, but I couldn't even imagine. Son." In a burst of emotion, Martin embraced Robert, and Molly joined in this strong family embrace, wrapping her arms around both of them from above. The general was happy that, in his old age, he was able to find the son he had lost more than 20 years ago and, with his help, to bring home his beloved daughter. Already after discharge, all three visited the grave of Robert's mother. Martin left a huge bouquet of scarlet roses near her humble monument. A month later, when Robert, Molly, and Martin himself were sitting at their home, the older man joyfully announced to the children, "That's it. I'm done, guys. I've decided to retire. Now I'm going to babysit my grandchildren instead of watching out for bribe takers. I couldn't bring up my son, so at least I'll bring my own grandchildren up. I still have strength. Only your task is to find yourself good life companions, those with whom you can go through fire and water. You got it, General," jokingly put her palm to Molly's imaginary visor. "Only first we need to find these satellites somewhere. Don't worry, sister. I'll make sure that you don't let guys like Michael come anywhere near you." The older brother assured her, laughing. Robert was very happy to find his family again. Thanks to his general father, he was able to restore his passport and gradually got his life back on track. The boy entered the Institute of Psychology and later was able to get a job in a good firm, where he could now hone his psychological skills in practice. With his father and sister, the relationship of the former homeless man was wonderful. They kept in touch, and just a few years after the events described, Robert and Molly played their own wedding on the same day. Now they have the most faithful and loving people with whom the brother and sister will not be afraid to go through life, and whom they themselves will love until old age. And of course, Martin's dream of grandchildren soon came true, and he is now babysitting 3 children at once. Molly had twins, Anna and Frank, and Robert and his wife gave him another beautiful grandson, whom the couple named Martin, in honor of their beloved grandfather. Now they all have only happiness and the brightest future ahead of them.